10 April 1802. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India began, with the aim to survey the subcontinent of India and accurately calculate the heights of the Himalayan mountains. The earliest journeys through the Himalayas were undertaken by traders and pilgrims. Many simply accepted crossing passes as high as 5,800 meters as a way of life. Others considered the Himalayas as a formidable barrier, with the first known Himalayan sketch map drawn as far back as 1590. Teams of surveyors spent more than 50 years working on an enormous land survey, measuring distances and elevations on the Earth's surface, all accomplished through mathematical formulas and the telescopes of the day. Surveyors were barred from entering Nepal by its government at the time, instead surveying from neighboring Tibet, forcing them to view peaks from great distances. Observations of the Himalayas were made from observation stations at a distance of more than 200 kilometers. In November 1847, Andrew Waugh, the British Surveyor General, and his team noticed a large peak about 240 kilometers away, which they began referring to as Peak B. Surveyors designated many peaks by letters and Roman numerals. Thus, at first, Mount Everest would simply be known as Peak B. Until 1852, Kanchenjunga was considered the highest peak in the world. However, Waugh wrote the observations indicated that Peak B was higher than Kanchenjunga, but given the great distance of the observations, verification would still be required. Peak B would come to be known as Peak XV by 1850, after reconfirming their suspicions upon further study of Peak B. In 1852, Radhanath Sikdar, an Indian mathematician and surveyor, was the first to calculate and identify Everest as the world's highest peak, at 8,840 meters at the time. In 1856, it was officially announced that Kanchenjunga was only the third highest mountain and that Peak XV was indeed the highest on Earth. Peak XV was then officially renamed to Mount Everest. Andrew Waugh recommended that the mountain be named after George Everest, his predecessor. The Royal Geographic Society subsequently chose it as the final name based on this recommendation. Sir George Everest, in fact, did not want the peak named after him, believing it was important to use local names, but Mount Everest would remain. It was announced that Everest was 8,840 meters high, later found to be higher. The local Tibet name for the mountain was to remain Chumalungma, goddess mother of the world, or Sagamatha, meaning goddess of the sky in Nepali. Thus, the great race to reach the top of the highest mountain in the world was born. The first recorded efforts to reach Everest's summit would be made by British mountaineers. In 18 May 1921, the first ever British reconnaissance expedition began. It would reconnoiter possible routes for ascending Everest and survey the surrounding areas, much of which was still uncharted and unknown. Foreigners were still barred from entering Nepal, so any approach would have to be from the north, through Tibet. The team consisted of 2 experienced mountaineers and 2 younger men, George Mallory and Guy Bullock, young students both without any Himalayan experience. The team also included a naturalist and doctor, a geologist and surveyors from the army. Any prior knowledge of the Himalayas would be based on the rough observations made from large distances years before. The expedition gathered Sherpas, porters, army mules and yaks to ferry supplies to Everest. The expedition set off from Darjeeling in British India for the 480-kilometer march to Everest. Not long into their journey, Alexander Kellis, a climber and high-altitude expert, died from a heart attack and a day's hike away from seeing Everest. They reached Tingri Jong, which became the base for the northern phase of their explorations. 2 days later at Chobuk, they reached the foot of Rongbuk Valley and were able to see Everest for the first time. 10 miles further was the snout of the Rongbuk Glacier, near where they established base camp just beyond the Rongbuk Monastery. After 6 days of acclimatizing and rest, the act of climbing higher and lower successively to adjust to altitude, They established Camp 2 at 5,300 meters. As the other climbers such as Rayburn had fallen ill due to the high altitude, much of the high altitude climbing fell on Mallory and Bullock. On the 1st of July, Mallory along with 5 Sherpas went towards the head of the glacier near the north face of Everest, and at 5,800 meters evaluated the North Col of Everest. There seemed to be no feasible way to reach the North Col, but above it, there seemed to be a way to get to the summit. Everest's West Ridge also did not seem encouraging from this location, so the West Rongbuk Glacier would have to be explored. On the 5th of July, Mallory and Bullock climbed the 6,900 meter Ring to get a better perspective of the complicated terrain. They were able to examine the upper north face and the north ridge above the North Col. To the west, there seemed to be routes that looked promising, near Pumori and the head of the Rongbuk Glacier. They hoped that a valley to the south of these might provide a good route to the summit, whilst there was still a possibility of finding a route from the east. During this time, the other members of the team, Morsehead and Wheeler, had been surveying the surrounding area and had collected and identified plants, animals, and explored other unknown areas. Howard Bury had been exploring to the east to find a suitable location for a future base camp. He had reached the district of Carter, where no locals knew anything about where their local river came from. He decided it would be suitable for an eastern base camp. They began exploring rivers that they suspected flowed from Chumalungma and reached the valley of the Ka-Ma River. They continued west, where they were able to see Everest's Kangshang Glacier and Kangshang Face, surrounded by some of the highest peaks in the world in the Ka-Ma Valley. Mallory wrote, they regarded scaling the Kangshang Face as impossible, with Mallory writing it was not for us. They judged Everest's northeast ridge as very difficult. The North Col and the north ridge above it were the only possibility left. By now, time was too short to return to Rongbuk, which clearly seemed the best way to reach the North Col. So they decided the best thing to do was to prospect a route to the pass Bullock had seen, which they called Lakpa La, to see whether the North Col could be reached this way. The weather was bad and the glacier treacherous, but they managed to reach the 6,800 meter Lakpa La on the 18th of August. Upon inspection, Mallory decided the route was feasible and would be attempted, as they returned to base camp for 10 days rest. Advanced base camp was set up at 5,300 meters and Camp 2 at 6,100 meters on the Carter Glacier. The plan consisted of a Camp 3 on the Lakpa La, a Camp 4 on the North Col, and one camp before the summit, whilst they waited for the monsoon to pass for over a month, with most of the team moving to advanced base camp on the 31st of August. They would remain there until the 20th of September for the weather to improve, where Mallory, Bullock, Morsehead and Wheeler set off for and reached Lakpa La. They realized the North Col could not be reached without an intermediate camp, so they returned to Camp 2 for supplies. Mallory, Bullock, Wheeler and 3 Sherpas went down to the East Rongbuk Glacier with the rest of the party. After a very difficult night on the glacier in cold and windy conditions, they reached the North Col on the 24th of September that morning. The terrain on the col was good for a camp, but the wind was extreme and no progress would be possible. They descended to the glacier where Mallory and Bullock calculated that they would not be able to set up a camp on the North Col, nor could they survive in a bivouac at 7,000 meters, a man-made makeshift shelter, all while the gales were getting worse and worse for the expedition. On the 25th of September, the party climbed again to the Lakpa La, striking all the camps by the 26th of September, returned to the Carter district, and eventually reached Darjeeling on the 25th of October, ending the expedition. Before the expedition had even left Tibet, the Mount Everest Committee had already begun plans to scale the mountain. The expedition was regarded as a success, with large crowds of people waiting to greet the mountaineers at the Queen's Hall in London. As the British were unsuccessful in reaching the North and South Poles first, they were determined to conquer the so-called Third Pole, Everest. The expedition was a particular success because it determined that a good route might be to approach the East Rongbuk Glacier and then follow the North Col route to the summit. Modern expeditions attempting Everest via the North Col route do not reach Langba La at all. However, when George Mallory and Bullock were trying to reach the North Col, the route from Rongbuk was unknown to them. To be continued.